It was a subject the first seminar way back in March 2014 engaged with, and we thought it'd be a good way to conclude the seminar series just to have an update on where we are there, particularly mindful of the fact the white paper's around the corner and it's a persistent issue anyway. So Antonio's going to kick off, and I will try and keep you to time as badly as I did last time.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks so much for coming today. Thank you to everybody who's been involved in the series. We're so grateful to you for giving up your time and your expertise. It's been a delight to work with the team and particularly with Robert. And we're really, really grateful to DCLG for collaborating with us and producing us in many ways. So I'm a lawyer, but I'm going to keep cases out of here today from bitter experience. Don't want to lose you and bore you. But the law here is obviously hugely important and massively interesting to me. So if you have legal questions, fire away. So what I was going to do was just do a recap since 2014, setting the landscape before we get some more individuated contributions from Sarah, from John and from Tom, and from Scott. So you'll be aware of this graph. I've stolen mostly DCLG's own data. So you'll see happily that the supply of housing is up, particularly the completions line. So that's good news. We now are looking, according to your figures, 189,000 new additions, of which there are 30,000 gains by switching use, and particularly the 13,879 change of use, of which the majority came, 12,800, from permitted development switching from office to residential. So we are getting a lot more supply. These are your data. The LGA, of course, have said we've got a lot more planning permissions out there. Their number is 475,000, but we can see the changes in the NPPF and the PDR rights in particular are producing more housing. So pretty much 2 years ago we were here, we were talking about housing supply delivery, and these were our general findings. I'm not going to talk about every bullet here because I'm afraid I took out all the pictures and some text. So I'm going to keep it fairly fast moving so you can hear the others. One of the things we particularly looked at obviously is neighbourhood involvement in planning, and particularly the kinds of contributions neighbourhoods were asking for in their plans, the kind of housing they wanted, as opposed to just quantitative number of housing units. You all know as well as I do that there are limits to future growth and supply, and particularly we have throughout the series uncovered questions about democratic involvement. You'll know this about the PD rights, the permitted development switches, but particularly evidence from the Somerstown and Newcastle events shows that sometimes participation is not quite as desired. But we will talk more about that in the last session. The bad news, of course, as you know, is that affordability is down, and significantly down. So of the 180,000 new units produced, this last year, we have about 32,000 units. The spike was high in the previous year, 2014 to 15. It flatlined in 2012, 13, 14, around the 42,000 mark. So the spike is contributed by the grey number, the affordable rent number, which most of you will know is 80% of median rent. So we can say that in some places that might be affordable, and in other places it won't be. But there are certainly questions about whether affordable rent is affordable at all. And we can see that even by the 2012-2013 numbers, the 2015-16 numbers are much lower, down by about a third. So the data, of course, shows that affordable housing is 52% lower in 2015-16 than it was the year before. So of all the houses we're producing, about a sixth are affordable, and half of that is affordable rent, so the 80% figure. So in those places in London, for example, where 80% of the average is not affordable, then we're looking at more like a 12th of the houses we're producing are affordable. The reasons for this, the reason that has been given obviously is the beginning of a 5-year cycle for funding, but most of us who work in the field are aware of all these other factors that are contributing. The decline in affordable housing grants, the 1% rent reductions imposed on social houses, viability, Section 106, Section 106BA, which allowed for a renegotiation of Section 106, which wasn't renewed in April 2006, but where there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that it's still happening. The permitted development changes, which obviously, because you don't need planning permission, you don't have to have any negotiations about affordable housing. So in general, supply is up, but certainly to national scale, prices are not going down.
So house prices keep rising. We're now at 2017, and the London figures are even more stark, around 500,000. And rentals are up. So it's not just that purchase prices are up. Rentals are up a lot, 2.3% in the last year as well. So this new experimental index that you've been trialling at DCLG. So Redfern Review, which many of you will know, the general growing view, I think this is probably our view that we had in 2014 as well, is that we can't build ourselves out of this problem. Supply alone is not going to fix it. We're not going to hit a magical number of units where prices are going to magically come down. So one of the things we've looked at throughout this series is demand. And we think it's time not just to focus on housing supply and diversifying sources of housing supply, but also to look at demand and how we might reduce demand. So we know that we have household increases, again your figures, 214,000 new households a year. So that's what we're building for. If this year was a good year at 189,000, you can see we're still under target, and of course the general aim is around 250,000 new units. So we're probably not building enough already, but if we were to take demand apart and say why have we got demand, the general reasons are life expectancy, immigration, lifestyles, and what I've called affluence. So life expectancy good, immigration good, lifestyles, many of us are divorced, living separately, people are living on their own in large accommodations, older people, far more single person households. By affluence, what I particularly mean is people using properties for second homes and a lot of buy-to-let investors by 50-something. The average age for a buy-to-let investor is 52. So if you've acquired a certain amount of capital, by then you may well be looking to buy-to-let. And we know from lots of research that buy-to-let is generally small portfolios, one or two houses, the majority of buy-to-let landlords. So can we look at changing demand? Can we build houses that better reflect people's needs? And we've seen this in neighbourhood plans, people calling for housing for older people and for local families. And can we think about how we might reduce demand by addressing affluence, addressing the question of buying for investment or second homes? So what people want is secure, affordable housing. And in universities we often talk about the difference between use value and exchange value, which obviously goes all the way back to Aristotle. But the use value of a house is that you have a home that is both secure and affordable. We can see that 14.7 million are unoccupied, and we've got the 4 million social and affordable, and the 4.7 is the PRS, the private rental sector. So the PRS is the least secure. The English Housing Survey consistently says it's the lowest quality. At the end of a 12-month term, you may have 2 months to dispute your possession, but then you are out. And rents, as we saw, are going up by 2.3% a year. So I don't think we can call that either secure or affordable. And in fact, what we do in this country, and it's very different from other countries, is that we thread affordability literally through bricks, through tenures. So if you're in social housing, the rent will be lower and they are much slower to evict. Council housing the same, and ownership, once you've made the initial leap, will be cheaper. So we have found that community-led initiatives can hold in perpetuity and that you can have philanthropic landlordism. But I know that Tom is going to talk about this in the context of CLTs, and we'll talk about it again in terms of neighbourhood planning. So the question that we've been grappling with is this idea of induced demand. So we know from all the road building protests that some of us were at in the 90s that the wider you build the roads, the more traffic you get. Providing more doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And this is clearly coming into the house building question as well. So Redfern talks about increased household formations, that perhaps unaffordability now is preventing people from moving to less dense household formations, but we also know that there may be more second homes, buy-to-leave and buy-to-let. And what we can also see is that we're building all these new houses, but of the increase in homes, so this figure's 171 from the year before, so 125 were in the PRS. So most of the new units we are building are for the rental sector, the private rental sector, where quality is worse, there is no security of tenure, and affordability is worse as well. And we know as a country, we spend 24.8 billion on housing benefit, which I find an extraordinary figure, subsidising private landlords. And we know also that this rests entirely in the Housing Act of 1988, And I always like this quote from the estate agent: "Every letting agent should spare a kind thought for the memory of Margaret Thatcher. They owe her their livelihood." Yes, we can see in this graph, 88 comes in there, that's when you get assured short-hold tenancies, and then the changes in buy-to-let finance and the products introduced come in the 90s, and we see an upward spiral. I love the 6 slides I cut, they were all upward spirals. Rent increases going up, it's a consistent pattern, you see this pattern. So investors, and I really do mean the private rental sector here because we're looking at demand, are interested in exchange value, not use value. Their aim, understandably, is to make money, to act as an intermediary between the house builder and the user. And it seems to me fairly obvious that if we have additional purchases in the market, then prices are going to go up. So we're not altogether surprised, and Redfern makes the same point, that prices are not going up because more people are being induced to invest. So we know that PRS tenure is not what people want. There is, as far as I can see, a complete lack of research on how estate agents are pricing, are dealing with security deposits, are looking at inventories, and how they have oligopolistic practices that are setting rent levels that aren't necessarily letting the market perform in the way it might be. So the terms of the lease, one of the frustrating things for a lawyer is that we will often see comparisons between England and Germany. And yet, of course, in Germany, there is no limited term. Tenure is unlimited. You can stay almost as long as you like. There are some exceptions. And rent is very much controlled. So we look at what proportions of people live in the PRS in England and in Germany. Yes, it's much higher in Germany, but it's a completely different lease. So we cannot really compare the two. We are seeing London living rents and other forms being combined with planning, and that's a really interesting holistic development. But it is very much coming through the GLA, obviously, and potentially a little bit at local authority level. Obviously, initiatives on build to rent. I noticed that PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, are encouraging people to invest on the basis that by 2020 they think 60% will live in in PRS. Just one last point is that we assume that the large PRS is desirable, even though we know that voters want ownership. We know, Cameron's turned generation rent into generation buy. So what can we do? Very briefly, we can focus on use value, not exchange value. One thing I really wanted to, or two things actually, the new decision in Cornwall that upheld the decision by a neighbourhood plan to prohibit new builds for second homes. That's very important because actually if you roll that out in London as well, if you had neighbourhood plans that constrict secondary home use, that could be quite influential. And of course the law is never spatially differentiated in this sense. There's no reason necessarily why it should be different in Cornwall than it is in London. And the use of covenants to stop ex-right to buy properties being used for the private rental sector. We know that of the houses sold, between 25 and 40% are now back in the private sector, so right to buy hasn't necessarily done what it should. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask if just have an initial reaction, perhaps from Scott, from a housing economics perspective. The complexity and interaction of demand and supply in the housing market is something which you specialise in, and maybe if there was any thoughts from Camilla on the policy side of things after that.
Okay, thanks Robert. I'll stand up. Those who don't know, we have Scott Dennison, Head of Housing and Planning Analysis at DCLG, and as Robert implied, I'm an economist, so there's probably a joke about an economist following a lawyer talking about markets, but just to echo what Robert said, it's a fantastic presentation. In particular, for me, great to see the use of all the stats that my team produces. I encourage people to continue to do that, and in particular on the English Housing Survey, if people want to get behind some of the headline reports on that, then you get in touch via Robert with me and we can make that happen. What to say? I think it's really interesting, the focus now, partly driven by the Redfern review, on focusing on the demand side. So if I just kind of think about it in pure economics terms, not saying anything about policy at the moment, I think it is true to say that sometimes the simplistic supply and demand analysis is too simplistic, that just building more supply will decrease prices. But you need to think about that a bit more carefully, I think. So Clearly, that would be true if the objective was to reduce nominal prices. You'll need to have a very large increase in supply. And I'm fairly certain no one's sort of suggesting that should be an objective. What is, though, true is when we look at our housing market model, and external estimates show this, is that building more compared to building less will decrease the rate at which the affordability ratio increases over time. So there is definitely good reasons to think about the demand side, and the presentation here and the Redfern review and other work is really good in thinking through those issues. But my own conclusion is that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about supply. In particular, if you run different supply levels through those sorts of models and vary the location of that supply, it being supplied in high demand areas has a much bigger impact for the same total number of housing than it being distributed more widely across the country. Thinking about the demand side, so as Antonia said, one of the so there's a whole bunch of demographic drivers of the demand side, which our household projection estimates capture. But then there's this thing called that was described as the affluence effect. So in our models, we have the sort of coefficient, the coefficient of income with respect to consumption of housing. And there's very consistent evidence, similar to a number of other goods, that as income rises, the propensity to consume housing, so this is the consumption aspect of housing as opposed to the investment aspect of housing, increases by a greater rate than the increase in income. Now, that increasing propensity to consume can manifest itself in a number of ways. So it can be a second home, it can be a home in a better location, and so on. But fundamentally, it's about more housing space. So I just think when we're thinking about issues around demand and possible demand management, there's quite an important welfare question about things that might restrict the ability of households to consume more housing space, which presumably we all think is a good thing. And we need to think about that welfare question and consequences in a general equilibrium sense. So thinking about all households in total as opposed to just the households whose incomes are rising and who want to consume more housing space. So clearly there can be trade-offs, but colleagues will say more about policy proposals. But thinking about the demand side is important, but I don't think it negates the reason to think about housing supply, especially in the right places. And I think there are sort of quite important welfare questions about anything that tries to dampen the sort of well-evidenced propensity to consume more housing as incomes rise. What else to say? I suppose the final thing I'd just say is the international comparisons. I was really struck by the point about Germany and it being essentially a different tenure. They're described in the same way. There's a real appetite in this department and elsewhere for comparative international evidence. So if people are aware of evidence that sort of sheds light on the problems in this country from overseas, I think we'd be really grateful to know about that. I think I'll probably leave it there.
Yep. Splendid.
Thanks.
Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, from the Housing Supply Directorate. A couple of things that jumped out to me. One, I previously led the private rented sector section, so I'm well aware of a lot of the issues in the private rented sector, including having one on Reading for the Surrey Council for the most hideously dangerous flat below, which was just appalling, and it goes on all the time. So I'm fully sort of cognizant of that. We are really pleased generally now in the autumn statement that there has been a shift on the mix of tenure for affordable housing particularly, so the shift away from purely ownership and rented, we think it's a really good thing. So, and obviously the additional money that came in behind that. The particular bit that I look after, well, I've got a few bits at the moment, but the particular bit that resonates with me with here is on the private rented sector and the build to rent sector, which I think is an exciting and kind of very new bit for us. So I think it's starting to be a more sophisticated picture in terms of how we talk about the private rented sector. I'm sure you all know about all of this kind of stuff, but just in case not, so built around, we're particularly looking at how we can get investment into that to build professionally run private rental sector stuff. And I think the thing that I find encouraging about that is the kind of money that comes in behind that is a different kind of money, and you might say kind of money. So pension funds or annuities funds where people need an ongoing return at quite a low level over 30, 40, 50, 60 year period. And professional private rental property is really suited to that. The thing that government has done recently is the private rental sector guarantee scheme, and we've just had our first deal that's gone through. So we're very pleased about that, and I think that will bring a different tenure which may be more appealing to people in terms of providing something in the rented sector, and that might start to shift how people think about owning or renting. People might genuinely, I mean, it's, to discuss, but if you can rent a property that provides all your needs, it's well looked after, it's well serviced, would you want to buy or would you be happy to rent? That might be a question. At the moment, there's things that we are seeing that's coming through. It is more at the higher end at the start, but it's a very nascent market in the UK at the moment. We don't see it in the same way we see it in the States. But we are starting to see some that are coming through that are not just building apartments, they want to do family housing. There's family housing in the north of England rather than what you might expect in London, which is kind of young professional apartments. So I think that's quite interesting, and I think it's just something we all need to keep an eye on, but I think that will have quite a big shift in it, and it might have a shift in how consumers think about it. So I think probably from our perspective, what we're starting to think about now, is generally trying to get a diversity in the market, trying to get a diversity of people entering into the market and a diversity of funding, because we think that will provide a range of options which hopefully might solve some of the targeted stuff that we know that we need. And also trying to think about it in the round. I mean, we're having conversations at the moment thinking if we can do more to encourage that kind of investment to build either for sale or for rent, can we do it in a way that is targeted? And so government to get involved at all, it needs to be where there's market failure, because if the market's here, we don't need to be there. But how else could we tie into things around the industrial strategy? If you're trying to encourage industry in an area, can we encourage institutional investors to build new housing for rent and sale so that they can work together? Maybe that's something that we could try and encourage. And obviously we'll be looking to see how we can make the best use of the housing infrastructure funding that's announced, which is there to do the long-term stuff, to think about how we can make things more attractive propositions to get housing happening, potentially in areas where you wouldn't normally expect it, just as a result of the market. All I want to say?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think it might be a point just to take any questions from the floor before we